The last decade of Halo has been tumultuous to say the least. Under the stewardship of 343, a studio purpose built to shepherd the Halo series forward, it has seen the release of new entries in the series and remasters, re releases of classic games. But in each case, things didn't always shake out as planned. And that has ultimately led us to today, which is the announcement of a studio change. That is, 343 becomes Halo Studios. But what led up to this? Why has this happened? What the heck is going on here with Halo? And what can we expect going forward? These are all things I thought we should discuss here in Digital Foundry as fans of the Halo series. Yes, we are well aware of the origins of the name 343, dating back to the original Halo. But I'm not alone in discussing this. I've brought along my fellow Halo-loving companion, the lovely, wonderful, always on point Alex Battaglia.
Oh, what a wonderful introduction. Yes, I am a big Halo fan. I think Halo CE is incredible. I really like Halo Reach as well. I have mixed opinions on other games, but in general, I would like to see the series again, at top form. So that's why we're talking about it today, right? Alongside the change of the studio name, there's also the announcement that there is going to be a switch to Unreal Engine 5, which is a really big departure for the series, which has always been running on some flavor of technology developed by either 343 or Bungie, or some sort of origin, who knows where that tech originally comes from. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I actually thought maybe the best place to start is actually with that Unreal Engine change. Like, what does it bring to the studio based upon what we know, John?
Digital Foundry is proudly sponsored by MSI's range of next-generation QD-OLED monitors, available in 32 and 27-inch 16:9 configurations, along with ultra-wide 32:9 49-inch and 21:9 34-inch models. These are some of the best monitors we've ever tested, with incredible motion clarity, HDR True Black 400 support, OLED burn-in protection, AI features, and genuinely game-changing performance. Check the video description to learn more, and for UK viewers, a chance to win an MSI 27QRX QD-OLED, a Metaphor ReFantazio PC and Xbox game code, and exclusive tote bag.
That's right. So clearly 343, like Bungie before it, specialized in building Halo games using their own internal technology. The most recent iteration of which was known as the Slipspace Engine, and this is what powered Halo Infinite. And although it looked very promising from the initial feeds and the trailers that they shared, the end result is a game that, while still attractive from an art direction standpoint, is one that also sort of falls short of the visual aspirations that one might have expected for the series, especially as a series known for often pushing the boundaries of technology, which I would argue 343 itself kind of did initially with games such as Halo 4,
Right.
which stands as one of the best looking games in Xbox 360. Clearly, the Slipspace Engine was an issue, I would say, for a liability even for the studio. And the final game of Halo Infinite definitely did not live up to where I would have expected it to land. And as a result, by shifting to Unreal, that does create some interesting opportunities, shall we say.
Right.
Now, I think, Alex, firstly we should say that we're generally not fans of studios abandoning in-house technology, and do tend to prefer seeing studios sort of leverage their own internal tech. That's very interesting to look at and discuss and analyze. But this is definitely one of those few cases where I actually see a compelling argument for making the shift, because I think from an engineering, manpower, money, and just general investment, it makes a lot of sense for them to actually make the switch to Unreal. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, to talk about some plus points about like this, like what you just described there, I think there's a synergy that comes with moving over to Unreal. For one, you have the synergy with the rest of the industry, where people who are either amateurs or they're learning at university, or their experience coming from other teams is having had worked already with Unreal Engine. So the pool of people you can hire from becomes a lot greater, instead of having to spend a lot of time onboarding them with the own software, that you have been creating, for example, for the last 20 years almost or so. Because I think actually Slipspace's origins still actually go back to what was made after Reach, right? With Destiny. I think that's like its original origins. So it's actually really old in that aspect. And they do mention that in the Microsoft blog, Xbox Wire blog, that kind of accompanied this announcement. So you have that synergy with getting a lot of people on board. You also have the synergy across Microsoft, I would say, where you have studios that use Unreal Engine pretty well, like Ninja Theory, as well as the Coalition, where you can lean on some of the technology maybe they're developing too, and cross-pollinate across teams at Microsoft. Also, just in general, I think there were some weak points to Halo Infinite's graphics that we talked about before, and to advance that engine to the next level of being future-proofed and current-gen only, because it was a cross-gen game, bringing it to have current-gen features like something like Ray Trace Global Illumination, that would take a lot of engineering time in general. And making something like that with the time and resources you could put into it, why not just buy the technology to do that in the first place? You know, something like Lumen, which comes as a part of Unreal Engine 5. Basically, you're spending less time making base tech stuff and spending more time potentially making game stuff, art, game content, instead of engineering time. And you know, I think that's a compelling reason to change over, as long with getting rid of legacy stuff. That engine that you can talk about too, there was a lot of legacy issues in it, I think, that we saw come to bear when Halo Infinite came out, right?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously things like indirect lighting was very limited. There was a lot of issues with the way that distant scenery was displayed. They didn't handle shadows well in that regard. A lot of limitations just in terms of just the overall level of detail on display and just everything else going on. It didn't come together in a way that I found especially compelling visually at a distance.
Right.
And was also very limited just in terms of modern image treatment. The image quality was not great. The TAA solution was rather poor, I would argue.
Oh, yeah.
Among so many, there's just so many other things. Plus, it launched with a lot of problems that were fixed, but things like consistency in terms of how frame rates were displayed in cutscenes. Anything that was not perfectly divisible by 60 or whatever, or 120 in that case, didn't display correctly, for instance. So there was definitely some strange issues there. So also, like you said, you know, working with Unreal sort of opens up the doors in terms of who they can hire. And knowing 343's previous sort of working methods with the high contractor turnover, employing a lot of people that would basically come in, work for a chunk of time, and then leave the project, it definitely behooves them, if they're going to continue down that road, to have access to people that can just jump in and start working with Unreal, rather than training them up on this new engine, using them for a year, and then they're gone.
Yeah.
Which, not great. And I think a lot of their problems probably centered from the way that the team was sort of structured and built, if I had to guess. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about, so I do want to kind of go through then the sort of like the advantages and the disadvantages of switching to Unreal, because on paper there's a lot of advantages, but there's also issues that we see crop up with this engine that have actually plagued nearly every release thus far this generation. Mm-hmm. So I mean, just let's get the ball rolling right away. Lumen is a big one, right? Because indirect lighting, just global illumination in general, something that Slipspace Engine didn't do well.
Yeah.
It really failed. It really fell short here, right?
Mm-hmm. There's enough images where you sent me over Slack of like just random glowing blue stuff during the Halo Infinite launch. That was a big issue in the game visually. I don't know, obviously, if they're going for that same semi-open world design, but in general, getting good indirect lighting is actually a big part of Halo's history, because both Halo 1 and I would say Halo 3 went especially overboard for their time period of doing really good indirect lighting and like good area lights and things like that. Baked stuff, but still really well done for the time period. And then it kind of fell short as you get to titles like Halo Infinite, which had different requirements, you know, moving times of day and larger worlds spanning across generations. Beyond Lumen, though, there's another thing that I actually thought about when you were even just talking about Halo Infinite earlier, and that was world precision issues. If you recall,
yes,
your hands and a lot of objects in the game world in Halo Infinite, especially on console for some reason, would like jiggle. It looked like precision issues.
It seemed like the further you got away from 0-0, the center of the world, the precision, the math precision, caused major issues with how the polygons were rasterized.
Yeah.
Or the vertices, I guess. So you get this sort of warping swimming effect that reminded me of Kingpin, if I'm honest.
Best game ever made, right?
These types of problems are not necessarily, like, they have existed, and it's a known thing, but usually I feel like engines sort of like move the center with the player within like a certain, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Rather than just having, here's the center of the world, and the farther you away. Basically, the problem is as the numbers get bigger, the amount of decimal places available shrinks. So your precision is like going down mathematically. And that seemed to be what was happening in Halo Infinite.
Yeah.
So we're going to see that go away. And in addition, of course, things like nanite will be available, which is something very specifically useful for like super large open environments, and Halo obviously goes for the sweeping vistas. Essentially, being able to eliminate LOD pop-in and get that nice smooth transition that nanite brings to the table will look really awesome. There's also some new stuff that was like recently revealed that I haven't actually had a chance to look at when I was in Japan.
Talk about that, sure.
The Mega Lights stuff. I only caught a glimpse, and that seemed interesting.
Yeah, and in a case like Halo, right now, like the trailer that they showed didn't evidence that at all, actually.
Probably not. It's very new.
It was very new also. But Halo as a series, Mega Lights basically allows for shadow casting from every single light source within reason, I believe. It's using ray tracing to do that. And a game like Halo, actually, historically, especially like since like Halo Reach, there's been a lot of like point lights everywhere. Like, all the enemies with their plasma bolts flying around. There's all these lights in the environment. All the Covenant architecture has tons of little tiny lights all over it. Even Forerunner structures tend to. And, seeing something like that in Halo would be really amazing, probably to amp up the atmosphere even more than this trailer already shows. One thing that I also thought about while looking at this trailer, they don't really show it off. They show off, like, I think 2 elites and Master Chief. The Master Chief. John Spartan.
117.
Yeah.
Mr. 117 himself.
Does he have a last name? He probably does. The lore nerds out there are like, how does Alex not know John Spartan's real last name? One thing Halo Infinite had, and I think didn't do too well in comparison to maybe even its predecessors, was character rendering. You had like that Pelican guy, the guy driving the Pelican.
Character rendering in Halo it's kind of an up and down thing. And
it's an up and down thing, right?
343 managed to nail it with Halo 5. The character rendering in that game was stunning. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Oh, that's what I was. Yeah. I was like, that's great, but then you get to Halo Infinite, it's like goes down again.
Yeah, it was a massive step down. Like it was like shockingly so. Like, wait, what happened here? Especially the pilot that you spend so much of the game with. He just looks so janky compared to everything in Halo 5. Which, yeah.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
I guess here they could lever. I mean, Unreal's very good with rendering humans. There's stuff like, of course, meta humans in there that they could potentially leverage for some things if needed. But I suspect it'll be more custom.
I agree
characters.
With that. Yeah.
There's no real reason to do that in a game like this. But I'm curious to see what they can do there with that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking about that. Also, I thought a bit about. Unreal recently introduced Substrate, or I say recently, it's like 2 versions ago at this point, but it allows for some more interesting types of materials than just, like metals and non-metals. Like diffuse and specular.
The 2 types of metal.
The 2 types of things on this earth. And, I think the Halo series in the past especially had some really interesting looking materials in it. I always go back to like those Covenant structures. They had like weird, funky space plastics and stuff. I could imagine that they could do some really great material work using something like Substrate to make Covenant stuff look really cool.
Agreed. So those are just some of the things that I think they could do really well, and you can kind of catch a glimpse of it in this initial footage. Although they very specifically stressed, which I thought was interesting, that they didn't want this to just be a tech demo.
Right.
It sort of ties into that whole like Foundry thing that they were talked about, where they're essentially assembling like a large collection of assets and just things that is like Halo appropriate that they intend to use in the game, and they sort of made it very clear that that is the goal. And I suspect that's sort of them poking back maybe at the initial reveal for Halo Infinite with the Slipspace Engine, which looked stunning and suggested that there was going to be a lot more going on in Halo Infinite than what there actually was in the end.
Yeah,
Huge
right?
disappointment that. So there's still the judgment's still out on that, but then there are some negative points to Unreal to consider, right? Especially, first of all, in its current iteration, it's still extremely heavy on the CPU, and there's still issues with sort of stuttering and like data streaming, just moving through the world. And this is going to be a large game, probably, I guess. And it feels like a perfect storm for this sort of thing to manifest itself. With the only caveat being here, or not caveat, but more like the positive thing being here, is that I can imagine them. I could see them leveraging knowledge from a studio like the Coalition in building this to ensure that, like they kind of did at the end to get Halo Infinite somewhat fixed up, to really help them. Like, I think if they do it right, it could be okay. But this doesn't. You can't just eliminate things like massive CPU bottlenecks right away. And this is something we've continued, I think, to be skeptical and I would say disappointed with in terms of basically every Unreal Engine 5 console game to date, where it's just absolutely they just don't run that well.
Yeah, they other than the 30 FPS modes, which are, you know, they're fine enough usually. It's Unreal's been super heavy for the consoles this gen, and they're only announcing this now, and we are already 4 years into this current generation, right? So maybe this is a next gen title. You know, that's something we'll talk about in a little bit, but, you know, and there's also going to be a lot of iteration between Unreal, between now and whenever this next title comes out. So maybe there's a lot of work to be done still to make that better. But that's one thing that made me a little bit worried, especially considering Halo games tend to be a lot more open than other, you know, first person shooters like Call of Duty or whatever. So another thing that I thought about with this is Xbox Series S scaling. Unreal has yet to scale super gracefully in every single game out there,
To say the least.
on this Xbox Series S. And I don't know, it'd be kind of weird for Microsoft to make a next gen only Halo at this point. Maybe this is what that is. I have no idea. But I was just trying to imagine the footage they were showing scaling to Xbox Series S, and I was like, no way. I just was like, no way.
Well, so that also kind of raises a point we have here, which is, to me, it feels like a very real possibility that this is going to be a multi-platform game.
Right.
Now, what those platforms will be is something that sort of remains up in the air because we don't know when they have plans to actually launch something. And given what we've seen in the past, essentially having to reboot the studio as they're doing, I can imagine that whatever they're trying to do will take time to reach the goal. So I don't expect to see anything for years.
Yeah.
So what's going to be the dominant platform? Will the Series S even be a consideration here? We can imagine that the Nintendo Switch Zwei, as we might call it, will have been on the market for some years and will probably be a potential target. But will it be able to run it all? Will the next generation of PlayStation already be underway? Like, what will Xbox have been doing at this point with its own platforms? There's so many question marks, so it's really difficult to know what they're going to do there. But I think in terms of like sort of tapping into the larger audience out there, the potential reachable audience, it does actually make sense to go multi-platform here, just in terms of like, especially if, for instance, let's say they decided to go back and remake the original Halo. They've kind of done the pseudo, it's kind of a remaster, I guess, the anniversary version, although I don't love the visuals they did for that one specifically, but they've not really actually remade it. And at first I'm like, oh, a remake, like we've got enough of that, you know, happening elsewhere. We don't need it here. But at the same time, if they're trying to then embrace a brand new audience, there is an argument to be made that it could make sense to actually do something like that, right?
I agree exactly with what you're saying. And I also think the move to Unreal Engine 5 broadens multi-platform support just per default. Yes, they could technically bring Slipspace to PS5 or even Switch too, but that is a more involved, totally doable thing, though. But in the case of Unreal Engine 5, it's baked in. And I think if I were them, I would release the next Halo on PlayStation, but that's me. Yeah, so John, that's kind of like the theory crafting and everything, about what it means for them as a studio. But what did they actually show in this video? Like, we actually saw some of the potential of what this game could look like.
Yes, we saw a lot of people sitting in rooms talking about Halo. But beyond that, they actually did admittedly show quite a few clips of footage that was specifically noted as work in progress content rendered in Unreal Engine 5.
Right.
And it shows multiple environments and biomes that you would expect from Halo, all very much leaning in the direction of Halo 1, I would say. Extremely reminiscent, in fact. And this is when they were discussing things like the Foundry concept that they're going for, where they needed to hit these specific types of places that, like the typical Halo environment, the sort of the environment taken over by the Flood, and then all like the Covenant architecture and internal ships and all this sort of stuff with the unique materials. And you kind of get a glimpse of that. I especially love the traditional outdoor Halo greenery they have with the conifer trees, and you've got the Chief standing as a posed action figure with the Covenant sort of there. This is where we notice things like you can see finally the visor on Master Chief actually seems to be a proper real-time ray traced reflection. Where it's not only reflecting his own, like, sort of his little horns on his helmet, if you will, but it's actually reflecting things around it in a way that looks to be actually very, very competent, like as if they're using hardware Lumen here,
right?
Essentially, rather than the SDF stuff from software Lumen. There's also nice reflections on the Covenant armor as well. And, just couple that with the general, like, the way everything is lit and shaded. Like, seeing Master Chief and other enemies sort of drawn in this way with actual smooth indirect lighting and sort of the contact shadows. The light sort of spills around the armor in a natural way with the expected shadows. You didn't get any of that in Halo Infinite, like, at all.
No, not at all.
It was just, like, the enemies and characters just sort of glowed in that game. They stuck out. It didn't really fit in. Now they do. And it's kind of almost jarring at first because they're not used to seeing it, but it's cool.
Right. It's like the first time we've seen super competent dynamic and direct lighting in a Halo game. And seeing those classic assets, like this is more like the original Spartan armor. Well, not the original, but the one that you see in like Halo 1, for example. And also like the OG pistol, it looks like there almost, which does make me wonder a little bit about what the content is they are making for this game. He's also fighting
some OG pistol.
Yeah, he's also fighting elites, and I thought like ever since like Halo 3, the elites are like the good guys. Like, I don't know. We'll see there, but yeah, that's definitely one thing I noticed, just like how much better the lighting is and what it does actually for something like the cool armor that the Halo series is known for. Another thing that I noticed is maybe one of the bad things about moving to Unreal, but I noticed like the stock Unreal Engine lens flares in the footage.
Yeah.
Like he takes out the energy sword and it's like, I've seen that lens flare type before. Or when they show the Forerunner, I don't know what they're called, but they shoot the blue lasers in the sky. Like that structure, that area, they also showed it off at like towards nighttime, and that's like the stock Unreal lens flare. That made me laugh a little bit. But another thing I noticed was virtual shadow maps. An issue with Halo Infinite. Yeah. Halo Infinite had some pretty bad shadows at a distance. Virtual shadow maps should really help that out. But still, they have their own issues. Like they show like the hand close up, a gauntlet, and you can see actually the shadow map resolution there, like the alias, when you look up close there. Something you wouldn't get with ray tracing, but this game's going to be coming out years in the future. So who knows actually what lighting and
Exactly.
shadowing technology they'll use by then. But that was another thing I noticed for certain.
Yeah, and everything just seemed a lot more dense, likely due to the use. They're able to sort of leverage nanite, right? The virtualized geometry stuff, which doesn't necessarily like you can obtain the similar results without relying on sort of that virtualized geometry system, but then you're dealing with classic LODs and LOD pop-in issues because displaying everything at full density is really difficult. That's the whole point of this, is that it allows these seamless transitions that are basically invisible to the eye, and just moving the camera around, you get this, it's very stable. Right?
Yeah.
Like you don't see things sort of popping and moving and changing as they did in Halo Infinite and other Halos and most games really. And that I really appreciate.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, some of the shots though, you look at them and then it's like you think back over the last 10 years of games and it's like, yeah, this shot with the grass and the waterfall, like that looks really good, but then it doesn't feel like a gigantic leap either. And it's and that's the thing, we're starting to deal with technology in this very granular sense, right? And like when, depending on how the art style is crafted and the way things are designed to look, you can still end up with something that looks beautiful and is technically very detailed, but it doesn't feel like it's like miles away from where we already have been, right?
Yeah.
It's a jump from Halo Infinite, but not necessarily from other games.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean. I think part of that is I think is actually changing the way like a game world is maybe developed. Like if it's like hand placed assets, it's gonna like evoke a level of artificiality in spite of the fact that it's maybe visually nice looking, like you said. But like, yeah, like because the real world is like formed by weathering and years and decades, centuries of
It just doesn't,
organic buildup. Yeah, the real world looks different than the pseudo Pacific Northwest of the rings, I guess. But yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I did get that feeling too while looking around the environment. One thing that I did like was, for the first time, we're going to see maybe per object motion blur in a Halo game. Something that the games I think probably could have used ever since Reach about. It would have been nice to have seen. But
well,
yeah,
you didn't like their anti-aliasing method in Reach, where it basically created blur on everything.
Less of a fan, actually, John. You'd be surprised. But I guess maybe a level of competence there. The one thing I'll also like is that presumably, if this does come out on PC, they'll have support for like DLSS, TSR, FSR, whatever. Something that Halo Infinite didn't have for
it did
not any good reason, actually.
The thing about Halo Infinite, though, I will say, is that because it's so light to run on the PC, you could at least crank up the res. I believe it's a game that had super sampling in it, so you could like increase the res slider. I was able to play it with a massively boosted internal res to sort of overcome some of those issues. You shouldn't have to do that, by the way.
No, you should.
But it was there. It was interesting.
Twice.
The thing is that's funny though is that obviously this is 343 stuff. Bungie's continued to do its own thing, and Bungie's been kind of in they haven't been doing great lately. But when you actually look back, so I recently loaded up Destiny again to play with my son for a bit in multiplayer, and I was actually kind of taken aback by just how good it still looks. Like just the way Bungie builds their environments and the way they art everything up creates something that just it pulls at your heartstrings in a way. You just see it and you're like, you just want to say, wow. Like even if they're not pushing the highest end tech anymore, there is something about the way that they make their environments that 343 as a company never actually managed to accomplish. It always felt more like a copycat, like somebody trying to make something that looked like it evokes Halo. It never really looked like Halo. It never really looked the Bungie way. And I don't expect that either. This is a different company. It's a completely different group of people. But this change here definitely creates something that looks noticeably different from what 343 has done in the past, I will say.
Right.
And that perhaps brings us to this whole name change thing as sort of a rounding off point, which on the surface is, so this is interesting. So on one hand, it's like, okay, it sort of puts a stake in the ground and said, this is where we're going next. This is what we want to do. it's admitting that it's like, this is a new direction. But admitting that is also like, yeah, we ultimately failed in the mission before it, right? Like, what kind of studio would want to rebrand themselves unless they needed to get away from the past? Which is what I think is happening here. I think it has essentially been determined that 343 as itself was not getting the job done. And I'm happy, though, that they seem to be turning a new leaf. And it doesn't seem to be a case of them burying their heads in the sand and saying, no, we're just going to continue as we planned. This is what we're doing. They really do seem to have understood that many things didn't go as planned. Even though I will say Halo Infinite as a game, the core gameplay it's very good. It plays very well. That's not the issue with Halo. It's everything around it and what you do with it that ultimately fell short.
Right.
You didn't have enough to do with what was mechanically a great game, is my complaint. And to me, this feels like they might finally, hopefully, get it, because this is also, to me, like possibly the last chance they really have to get this right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's incredible that they're giving other chances at this point, though, after... If you think
when so
back,
many other studios don't get that chance.
you can be hi-fi rush makers and then not get that chance, although you made like one of the best games of that year. Tango. My take on it is a bit similar to yours, actually, John, where I do see this as, like, as they describe it, like a new beginning, and I hope, though, unlike what was reported on the past, that they do have a very different internal policy about how they bring people on board and keep them. Because it seems like one of the core issues pre-Halo Infinite's launch was just like maintaining a group of people to actually build a game to a certain size. And, that contractor stuff that you read about. And it seems like no wonder Microsoft has trouble producing first party games at times. They're just not, there's just no one, they're not building a culture of people who actually make a game in a dedicated way. And I hope that doesn't happen with this time around, but there's no evidence of that anywhere. So that's just me talking. But in terms of the game itself, I do think, like you, Halo Infinite, the core shooting, the core movement was all there. I think some of the gun design isn't perfect.
No, I agree.
There's a lot of this is a battle rifle, but not. But yeah, like the original stuff is just like all these weapons are super distinct. But I do think there was a core there that was great. It was just the whole what it was embedded in that wasn't so great. And I hope they, not going back to the basics, but that they can something to make Halo exciting again, like it was back in the day. And I think an approach to it from a visual perspective is not unwarranted. They do mention in this video, like, Halo was known for being a ridiculously good-looking game when it came out, and that is true. Yeah, for most stuff, obviously you look at Captain Keyes.
Character models and cutscenes were pretty bad for the time, but everything else around it.
Yeah, like you look at the shading and the environments. It was focusing obviously on different things.
Yep.
But I'd say like that was the thing that really drove Halo: large environments, cool stuff, interactivity, and them focusing on that, I think, is really, really good idea. Presuming it isn't just an empty shell at that point, but I guess we'll have to see. Best. Well, I'm hoping for the best, but I'm also not convinced, because we saw, like before, like you say, in like 2018 Slipspace for the first time, I think it was, that all those shots are still amazing looking. All that could have been an amazing game if it looked like that, but it just never did, right? So I'm also having a large pinch of salt regarding anything shown as a result of that, because you have to build up trust, right?
But at the same time, I think we're all pulling for these guys. They need success. Mm-hmm. They've been through some tough stuff. They actually need to get that success, and I really hope they find it with this. And I hope that Halo can come back in a way that makes it relevant and interesting to people again. And I also hope that they consider trying to follow like all the service trends and make it, I think that there's still room for this sort of more of an old school thing, and I think like Halo itself, you got to go for what a lot of those fans wanted. I think I don't know. It's tricky. It's tricky.
Yeah.
That's for sure. But either way, we're pulling for you guys if you're watching. We want to see it succeed.
For sure.
But that's going to do it for this. Just a sort of discussion thing, because obviously coming back and seeing this was the first thing I saw. When it's like, what happened while I was away for 2 weeks, and I was like, oh, Halo stuff happened. I thought we should talk about it here on the channel. But it was good to have you here, Alex, to talk about it.
I loved it, John.
All right, let's Halo. Let's mosey. We'll be keeping an eye on this, of course. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.